Welcome to October and a good afternoon to our regular and new listeners who have joined us today on live stream. And also if you're listening on to the recording, welcome to you as well. I'm really looking forward to sharing the next 75 minutes with you today and with our accomplished panel. We invite you to lead in and let's hear your thoughts on leadership for the 21st century business culture. Let us know where you are joining us from and what your leadership role is that you're playing in your life. Use the chat box for that. On July 18th, 2007, on his 89th birthday and a year before the subprime crisis hit, Nelson Mandela convened a group of independent global leaders called the Elders. Mandela, born of course in the Eastern Cape, formed this group on the belief that leadership is generative. It is concerned about the care and growth of future generations, helping them to live with dignity and raising them to new levels of morality and motivation. Today, 1 in 5 South Africans is going hungry, that's 20%, and more than 2 million South Africans lost their jobs during Q2, bringing our unemployment rate up to more than 40%. Leaders across business, politics, and society don't have the right answers, and no university textbook can direct leadership decision-making in 2020. Why is the discussion about leadership so important? Well, because the decision and actions of leaders today have systemic consequences, which, in turn, influences sustainable growth and prosperity of future generations. We see legacies of past leadership's mistakes daily in the state of climate change as a result of the profiteering third industrial revolution, the consequences of the apartheid policy on the South African society and psyche, the state of our economy and trust deficit as a result of the last administration. And in the Eastern Cape, we are a province battling to survive as a result of ineffective leadership, poor systems of governance, an incoherent growth plan, and a dwindling tax base. Yet, we have the opportunity of utilizing a rich base of human, manufactured, social, and natural capital. On the financial front, the state of the accounting profession and corporate scandals have diluted trust in the private sector's stewardship and leadership. If the guardians of governance in politics and business fail us, what impact does that have on our business culture? South Africa is a leading global advocate of good governance and integrated business models, yet we are grappling with basic socio-economic challenges and systemic failures. The public and private sectors should be working together to build better, but there's little appetite to do so constructively and coherently. Then there's the issue of short-termism, which I and many political commentators and asset managers believed was a South African issue. Listening to the US presidential candidate debate earlier this week, I became very anxious about the myopic state of global leaders. What future are they projecting and towards what purpose? I'm not sure. Global citizenship in this context seems like a pipe dream, given the state of our geopolitics. There is no doubt that off this low base, we can only do better. We must appreciate that leadership roles are complex. We are all leaders in some areas of our life, most importantly of our own self-mastery. The journey of business and life requires mental strength and emotional resilience to sustain effectiveness, trust, and build confidence among stakeholders. From leaders, it requires versatility, competence, and more increasingly, EQ. This is especially the case in 2020, when leaders are trying to build brand new pathways into an unknown future and carving through narrow and outdated institutional tunnels, which in our case is still powered by a coal-chugging Eskom. So what does pioneering visionary leadership look like in the 21st century? And what are the building blocks to develop an economically vibrant Eastern Cape and South Africa by 2030 and beyond? So let's introduce you to our panel today. Paulo?
Thank you, Roshni, and a warm welcome to all our listeners in this webinar from a very cold Eastern Cape today. I'm delighted to introduce our panel, Dr. Nozipho January Bardell, who is the chairperson of the UN Global Compact Local Network in South Africa and the chair of council for Nelson Mandela University. Palmi Natazan, CEO, the Institute of Directors in Southern Africa, and Klankla Kwabe, founder and managing director of Muntamo HR Services. I invite you to interact with us today by posting your questions and comments in the chat room. We will do our best to attend to those questions as we proceed through this webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Roshni.
Thanks, Paula. I echo your invitation to our listeners. We really want you to be part of this conversation because it does impact our future in many ways. So let's get into it. For many, leadership is a calling rather than a career destination. So to all three of you, I have had the privilege of knowing and working with you in various spaces. Palmi, as good accountants, let's declare up front that we were at school together. And you always struck me as someone who had a very clear direction, an opinion that was anchored in facts, and a passion for excellence. That has served you well in your career. We also shared then an alma mater and more recently know each other from the Institute of Directors space. Schnelldorfs, we know each other from my Aspen days. Your humility and very intentional manner always struck me in a fast-paced entrepreneurial culture, and yet you garnered great respect across the global growth. Some technical hitches, and I believe Trevor's managed to get us all back. So just to go a step back, I was introducing Palmi Natazan from the Institute of Directors. I was then speaking to Schnelldorfs Twabe, who I know from Aspen, and I'm sure to those who are joining us from the Aspen factories in Port Elizabeth and East London that you need no introduction to Schnelldorfs. Schnelldorfs, what I was saying is that your humility and very intentional manner struck me in a fast-paced entrepreneurial culture. You garnered great respect across the global organization, and you also have a track record for working with dynamic, high-performance businesses. Nozipho, we met at the Nelson Mandela University when you joined us as the chair of council. And in that short time that we worked with each other, you struck me as an incredibly accomplished leader with a grace and compassion that is transformative. We also share deep interest in matters of ESG and responsible investment. So I've given that context to our listeners because at this stage, I really am very keen and curious to understand more about your leadership journey. What is your why as a leader? And how have you perhaps had to adapt your natural leadership style in 2020? Let's start with Palmi.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Roshni, for that introduction. So you've already given some background into school days and university days. But yeah, I left the Eastern Cape to start articles, really, and I've been up in Johannesburg ever since then. And yeah, I've served articles and then moved on to the IOD, where I've served 3 different roles, the last of which was CEO a year ago, just before I turned 40. So yes, it's a lot has happened in my leadership journey. And I think, listen, hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, the old-fashioned way, has gotten me very far. I think also this just trying to do the right things for the right reasons. And that's even now when I'm making decisions for my business, I often ask my staff, but why are we doing this? What do we want to achieve with this? What is the end goal? And is it the right thing to do? I remember back when I was in school days, there was a big focus on IQ. It was almost a competitive thing on IQ. And then when I was in university days, I remember a shift to people starting to talk about EQ, the emotional quotient, and people starting to say EQ was as important as IQ in order to be a successful human being. EQ talking to things like self-awareness, communication skills, all the so-called soft skills. But now what I'm seeing is people are talking about not only IQ plus EQ, but SQ, a social quotient, which I think is what we're going to need into the future. Every organization, every individual and every organization exists on this planet and has a duty towards everyone around us and towards the planet itself. And that social awareness is just becoming more and more important. I mean, we see what's happening. You mentioned some of it earlier around social inequalities, around environmental impacts of business and all of that. And I really think this year specifically, look at what's happened with this pandemic that we've faced, and look at what happens when human beings don't look after nature, and what comes back to us as human beings and comes back to us as business. So yeah, from my side, it's IQ plus EQ plus SQ that's going to take us forward as leaders into the next era of business.
Thanks, Fahmi. And 2020, how has that perhaps needed some adaptation of your own leadership style?
Sure, it's for me, it's been pretty similar, but I guess just the new world brings with it new challenges. I mean, we've spoken about digital for so long. Business has been speaking about the need to move to digital, but none of us had this push like we had now, where we had no other choice. What was amazing for me was how quickly we needed to adapt and how quickly we did adapt. How quickly businesses adapted their services. They were innovative in coming up with ways to still keep functioning, to still earning, being able to earn revenue, and to still keeping their workforce busy, which was actually wonderful to see.
Thanks, Fahmi. Let's move on to Schnelldorfs.
Thanks, Rosh. So my leadership journey started many years ago, pretty much when I was still a student at the University of Zululand. Was quite involved in student politics, being the vice president of the SRC. And one moment that really stands out for me was when we camped at the rector's office because they were not allowing students to register. And the rector left us there. We slept there without food for about 2 days. And but that experience for me taught me about how important education is, but also that as a leader, it's very important that you sacrifice for the people that you lead, that you ensure that the people that you lead come first, and remain humble. And these have remained really the cornerstone of my leadership approach in all the organizations that I've worked for. So I've worked for FNB, and that's where I started my career, moved to MultiChoice, DSTV, which is a South African multinational, worked for Nike, Aspen, and MTN. And these leadership traits that I've just highlighted have remained really the core of my approach to leadership throughout the years. And I've seen the impact of those traits. My take in terms of leadership in the 21st century, for me, there are a couple of things that are important to note in terms of the context in which businesses are operating. And I would want to highlight a few because there are many. But I think one, the issue of generational gap has been mentioned and has been a topic for a number of years. And I'm not sure, though, if our leaders today, who happen to be much older, and definitely we're getting more younger people leading organizations. But for me, that's very important because currently we have 5 different generations, occupying our workplaces. And for me, that context is important for a leader to understand because it speaks to the leader's ability to manage diversity. So for me, diversity in this context is about these 3 different generations because their approach to work is different because they've been socialized and brought up differently. The second piece is around technology and the whole issue about the 4th industrial revolution. Again, that context is important for a leader to understand clearly. We have the pandemic that we are still experiencing currently, and it calls for a different kind of leaders. We've got unprecedented job losses, and we're talking about this earlier on. And again, leaders today need to understand how to deal with employees and organizations that have had massive retrenchments in their organizations and also within their sector, but also the changing skill sets that are resulting from the influence of technology in how work is done. So for me, those are some of the few things that inform the context within which business is operating today. So therefore, what does this mean in terms of the kind of leaders that we should have in organizations? One, for me, leaders that we have or we need during this time are leaders that who can lead effectively during a crisis, and a crisis of massive proportions like the one that we are experiencing now. Secondly, it's about resilience. I think that for me, this is one of the things that I think is going to become one of the competences that leaders will be measured on as we go into the future. Agile leaders, I think, are going to be very key also in our context. Diversity mindset, as I mentioned earlier on, is also another important trait. And innovation, this pandemic has I think, presented many leaders with opportunities, massive opportunities, but only the innovative leaders would have taken advantage of those opportunities that are presented by a pandemic such as COVID-19. The ability to communicate effectively is becoming even more and more important, considering that now the whole issue of working from home or in remote areas has become a common feature for most employees. And if you are a leader and are not able to communicate effectively with your employees, I think a lot of things and messages will be lost along the way. And lastly, it's leaders who are able to show empathy. The employees that are in workplaces today, they've either been affected directly by COVID-19 or someone that is in their families or relatives or neighbors. And therefore, when they come into the workplace, they come with that kind of background. And we do need leaders that have and that demonstrate highest levels of empathy. Thanks, Roj.
Thanks, Schnelldorfs. Nozipho, you're joining us from traveling on the road, so I hope that our listeners, are able to hear you. Do you want to take us through your leadership journey, your why, and what 2020 has required you to do as a leader? Dr. Bartle, you're on mute.
Yeah, so thank you. I am going to turn my camera on. And I've just experienced the vagaries of connectivity in the Eastern Cape in real time. But very happy that I'm able to connect to all of you and say good afternoon also to all the people on the call. Well, my leadership started when I was very young, actually, as a school teacher. And my first job when I was in my early 20s was actually in a boys' school teaching English, literature and language. And what that taught me really was how to relate to young men as a woman, and became very aware of, power relations in the classroom between myself as a young teacher and also with young lads. It taught me a lot of patience, but it also taught me how to be an assertive woman. So I've always been conscious of the fact that I'm not just a leader, but I'm also a female leader. I think the second thing about that experience is the understanding of other people. I think it's important to be sensitive to people, because people either make or break an institution, and the relationships between those who lead and those who follow is a very crucial one. And I think I learned also that if you're a leader, you should lead and not be afraid of actually leading from the front. And in most of the work that I've done, I think many of the most effective leaders I've worked with are those that actually don't mind taking the lead. And we recently had a very interesting experience at the university, where through COVID, we lost the professor who was responsible for our public health program, who came in 2017, and after 2 years, he'd almost finished building this wonderful hospital that we'll soon be launching at the university. But he also had the humility to lead from the front and taking everybody along with him. So a principle also is, when you do lead from the front, but don't leave others behind. I think 2020 has really, for me, amplified the importance of understanding what's happening in our environment in a very broad way. Our political environment is very important to understand as a leader, but so is our social and our economic circumstances. I think a combination of all three is important, because if we don't understand the relationship between politics, I think it's very hard to understand what we are supposed to do as leaders. And I'm not talking about party politics here. I'm really talking about the political process in our countries. Understanding for us here in South Africa, what the ruling party's agenda is very important for every leader. It doesn't matter in what sector you are. So one thing I also learned is not to be an ignorant leader, but one who does understand what is happening at all levels of our society. The university recently has taught me the value of engagement, how to be a university that is sensitive to its environment, to the society that we live around, and how to engage with that society so that at the end of the day, we understand the impact that we're having on it, so that we are not just a university for the academic staff at the university and the other people who work there, but also for the people who live around the university. So that social consciousness of being relevant, but at the same time being very agile and responsive is also a very important part of the leadership that I've experienced. In recent years, in my role as a governor, as a board member at AngloGold Ashanti, I've learned so much about the whole issue of sustainability. The mining industry in South Africa is very old, it's very established, but it's also it has been very staid in the way it has responded to people in our society. And there we really had to do some serious transformative work to try and make the mine communities see that there's value for them in the work that we were doing. So I think the entire sort of governance, social and economic issues, the ESG issues, the environment issues are becoming very prominent. And for me personally, it's been very encouraging to hear shareholders talk more and more about the relationship between the environment, the society, and good governance. And to see that they cannot simply look at profit only. They have to be sensitive to people and planet as well. So yes, lots of learnings. Continuing to learn is something that I think all leaders need to do, to sort of learn as you go, not not leaders if you know everything. And I think being a generalist, I still prefer to be a generalist leader rather than one who has particular focus on one subject. I'm glad I'm not an accountant leader, for example, or a legal leader for that matter, because I think sometimes my experience of accountants, and I'm being very frank about this, has been that the leaders who have been kind of specialists in one area have tended to see the world through those spectacles only. Yeah, so I'll stop for now, and we'll listen to the other questions that you have to ask.
Thank you to all three of you. And, you know, just taking on the last point, I often say to people, I'm an accountant because I strive to be accountable. And I'm sure that Pami and Paolo are probably going to say the same. And it's, you know, something that struck me that all three of you mentioned, it's about context. It's about the integration between the technical know-how, the professional competence and experience, and also this growing need around what Pami called the social intelligence, what we call governance, what we call a social orientation, especially when one's trying to drive a stakeholder-centric approach. The complexity in leadership, of course, is that, like I said, it's not a destination. It's not a title that makes you an effective leader. It's an ongoing journey. It's a continuous evolving process. So we hear about this term effective ethical leadership in corporate governance circles. Pami, Schlanschler, and Nozipo, what does that mean practically in the business and organizational context? And looking ahead now to 2030 and beyond, what can boards, executives, and leaders in the business do to make this that much more practical and that much more effective? Let's start with you, Pami.
Sure. So I think since I'm coming from the IOD, let me give you the King 4 context to ethical and effective leadership, right? And that's where we use the acronym ICRAFT. For those who haven't heard it, I stands for integrity, C for competence, R for responsibility, A for accountability, F for fairness, and T for transparency. And we say leaders that exhibit the principles of ICRAFT can essentially be ethical and effective leaders. And if we break it up, integrity in essence is talking about doing the right thing for the right reasons. So it means when we're making decisions or choosing which path to take, we need to suspend our own instincts to act in our own self-interest and act in the interests of the purpose of the organization that we've been entrusted to serve in. Competence is all about having the necessary knowledge, skills, and experience. How often do we see individuals being appointed to high-profile positions because of who they know, not necessarily because of what they know, which results in them being unable to fulfill their duties effectively, Then there's the R, which is responsibility, and we have to take individual and collective responsibility as leaders here. And discharge our duties and do so in a responsible manner. Accountability talks to us being able to we need to remain accountable even when we've delegated or we've passed down things to others, or we have board committees, or we have management, etc., that we give functions to. The leaders have to remain accountable at the end of the day. We can't say it's someone else's fault because we delegated to them. And it's about having those checks and balances in place as a leader, because you also can't be everywhere. You can't see everything. So you need to have checks and balances in place. And you also need to have trust in the people that you are appointing and that you are delegating to. Then the F is about fairness. And this talks a lot to, a number of us earlier spoke about this whole social context, etc. Now, when we talk about fairness, we need to remember that an organization has a multitude of stakeholders. Long gone are the days where we used to talk about acting in the best interest of the shareholder, because the shareholder is but one stakeholder in an organization. There are others. There are employees, there are suppliers, there are customers, there are the community in which the organization operates, and nature itself is a stakeholder to business. And we need all of these stakeholders in order to operate. So we don't only need the financial capital that the shareholders provide, because we could have all the money in the world, but if we don't have employees, would our business function? If we don't have the support of our community or our customers, would our organizations function? No, they wouldn't. And fairness is really about balancing the trade-offs between the various stakeholders, because every decision you make, you're basically balancing trade-offs between your stakeholders. And then transparency is the last one. I think it talks to itself. We need to not be afraid of people asking questions and people wanting to know what's happening. You know, if we are acting with integrity and we are competent, we won't be afraid of this magnifying glass, because we have nothing to hide, because we know we've done the right thing and we've made the right decisions to the best of our knowledge and ability. And for me, I often go back to iCraft because and not even for us as leaders in business, I even when I speak to high school prefects, for example, or any leadership position, I think the principles of iCraft are a really nice framework to go back to.
Thanks very much for unpacking that, Pami. And Pami mentioned two important things. A, the leader can't be everywhere. And secondly, accountability rests with the leader, but the responsibility can be delegated. And when there's delegation, there needs to be two things: trust in the person you're delegating it to, and secondly, empowering the person to carry on that mandate. Shansha, from your side, I mean, you've led high-performance global organizations. How do you practically implement this from an executive level and really embed this in the organization?
Yeah, I think for me, it starts with the leader's value system. For me, it's very important, and how in their leadership roles over the years, they've demonstrated ethical leadership. And thirdly, and how often organizations have got, values that they espouse. And you'll find that, integrity or ethics is one of those. But the question is really how many, organizations, for an example, measure and assess leaders on an annual basis around how they live up to these values. So my argument really is that until leaders, are measured, and I'm talking in terms of performance around how well they demonstrate, these kinds of values, you're never going to see much difference. So for me, how you can integrate this into an organization is really to measure these on a regular basis. And it's very easy to measure because you've got a number of stakeholders that the leader interacts with. You could use, for instance, a 360 assessment process where the number of the different stakeholders that interact with the leader are able to give their input and views and feedback on the leader. So for me, the crux of it is around the value system that the leader demonstrates in an organization.
Thanks, Dansha. And interestingly, you mentioned the Leadership 360 tool that you use in a 2019 report that Deloitte published on leadership emerging themes. What they found was that although companies recognize that a different leadership model is required, the leadership measurement systems continue to be of a past legacy. And how do we reshape them to actually start thinking about leadership and how leadership's capable of navigating through uncertainty? And maybe Paolo can facilitate this for us a little bit later. Nozipa, I want to get to you before I hand over to Paolo. And you have led in the global ambassadorial context. You have also leading large kind of organizations in South Africa and also leading the UN Global Compact Sustainable Development Agenda. How do you see ethical, effective leadership and where these principles are going to on a practical level? Nozipo, can we ask
yes.
you to
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, ethics and integrity are such important words in the context in which we all live at this time, especially when we experience a lot of kind of populist politics. And as you made mention again to that amazing debate the other day in the US, the whole difference between leaders who are untruthful and leaders who are truthful. I think for me it's been such an amazing example of what happens when leaders don't tell the truth, and how dangerous it really is for all of us. So I think the global context also for me has helped in that regard, because I think what's happening in the world is actually strengthening the value of the global compact, because through that we are promoting the values of human rights. We are also promoting the values of no corruption. We are promoting the values of taking care of our environment, and also of fair labor practices in a nutshell. And all of those require a certain level of truthfulness, so that when you're working in a large mining company or a listed company, for me, what was important was really to understand the sort of, it was important to understand the Gini coefficient of our organization. Please, can you? Yes, we just needed to understand the Gini coefficient of the highest paid person and the lowest paid person. And asking for that confirmation, for that kind of information, can create quite a bit of let me say, to be a bit disruptive and ask those kind of questions. So it also represented for me the whole idea of, how do you do the right thing when nobody's looking? Because for me, that's also what ethics means. It takes a lot of courage to challenge the status quo, and not in a way that is reformist, but in a way that really transforms the work that we do. So I think it's very, very important for us to really understand the value of truthfulness, and living by it. Increasingly, I find that it works for leaders, because we are able to distinguish ourselves from being part of corporate citizens, like companies are, but also part of being citizens of our countries. And so when the chairperson of one of our boards went on a mission to save our country, he was the same person who was also changing the company inside, because he recognized the dual role he plays as a citizen who took his citizenship very responsibly, but also took the leadership of the company very responsibly. And I think for me that represented truthfulness, so that you don't have two personas, a public and a private persona, one that is one way at home and one that is another way at work. Because I think that it was a huge lesson. It continues to be a huge lesson and a challenge to be the same person at home and at work. I'll stop there, Rashni.
Thanks, Nozipo. What you've illustrated is really what Schnelldorfs was packing into the term diversity. And it's about having that open mind to listening to different voices in the boardroom or in the workplace. But from a leadership side and from an executive side, often, the voice that dissents or the voice that has something different to say is not towing the party line. So that requires some courage. Paolo, I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts on this and to lead us through some of the themes that have emerged, based on your context around organizational development and cultures.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Roshni. But before we do that, I'd like to just highlight a couple of comments that have come through from the listeners. So Keith Sharp mentions that the panelists have mentioned some of the traits that leaders should possess at this time. And he'd also like to add honest and determined, in other words, to carry out the mandate, which I think is possibly what we have been discussing. And Palmi made a lot of reference to that in the use of your acronym through iCraft. We have another question, another few questions which I thought were quite interesting from Jeff Walton. He says, I'm a counselor. I'm interested in if we had leaders before what has happened. People have or are losing faith in business and political leaders. Why is leadership apparently failing? What are the contributory aspects and how do we change that? So I think those are some really powerful questions, which I think we should open to the panel first before we talk about the implications on leadership, structures, and organizational culture. So are our leaders failing? And if so, why are they failing?
Well, Zippo, do you want to take that question and then I'll ask Palmi to maybe add to that?
Thank you, Rashni. I think some leaders are failing. I wouldn't want to say all leaders are failing. I think some leaders are failing because maybe they have lost a sense of purpose, to real understanding why they are leading and what's the intention behind the leadership. They haven't got their eye on the ball. I think that I've experienced both good and bad leadership, and from the good leaders that haven't failed, I think they've had a vision that is beyond their own personal interests, that really take into account the interests not only of their company, but also the interests of the societies in which they live. And increasingly, those leaders have been willing to kind of also learn more about the environment, and are willing to make the changes, and I've seen it happen in my working life, which has now been more than 40 years. So I think some leaders are failing. I think our political leaders largely are failing because, political power is huge. For me, I think it's the most powerful form of power, because you're spending resources that are not yours. You're spending resources that your citizens have given you, have voted for you to spend in their interests largely. And it's a shame, to be honest with you, that some of our political leaders do not understand what it is that they're doing, because they don't have a vision, they don't have purpose. And unfortunately, lots of casualties along the way, because that sense of deep responsibility, that sense of wanting to do the right thing at the right time when nobody's looking, is just not in their consciousness. And I think for me, it has everything to do with not having purpose and not being committed to people, and understanding power. And how power can be both constructive. You can do so much with the power that people invest in you, but you can also use that power to be completely destructive.
I have to agree with Dr. Badal, and I think also from my perspective, yes, we've seen leaders fail in government. We've also seen leaders fail in business and corporate. I mean, how many corporate scandals have we seen recently? And for me, I don't know, and look, we don't want to paint a brush, as Dr. Badal says. There are some doing a really great job. But the ones who haven't, I question whether we have the necessary moral compass in what we're doing. And then I also question, when things go wrong, why we don't see more consequences. Because there's been so many times where I've seen someone's removed from a position of trust because of an ethical issue, only to be reappointed in another position of trust a little while later. And to us as society, we're losing trust in government and in business, because for us, it doesn't feel like there are any real consequences for this bad behavior, if I can call it that. I also think we need to look at how people are being appointed. are we appointing people with the necessary moral compasses and that vision and purpose that we're looking for? When we're appointing people, or are we looking at their track record in terms of their share price growth in their previous organization? Are we looking for mavericks who are going to make decisions just to grow the share price at the cost of many other things, including the company's reputation? And I think, we need to just internalize, when making appointments, are we really looking for the right things when appointing some of these leaders?
Thanks, Pami.
Thank you, Hlaka, for that. So, what I suppose I'm observing is that we've orientated this discussion towards leadership as being something political to an extent. We've talked a little bit about business, but we had a good comment from one of our readers, or from one of our listeners, Nondumiso Dana, who said, how do we change leadership styles to adapt to certain environments? And I think that's really the crux of what's been happening during this time of the pandemic, specifically because the context changed and shifted. And so too do the leadership capabilities and capacities need to shift. And ultimately, organizational culture will shift. So I guess I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on what you believe will be the shifts in organizational culture. Because never have we had a time where everybody's existentialism has been rocked to the core by a time like this. And so I do believe that there's significant shifts coming that have happened already, but maybe you just want to pick out one or two shifts that you've perhaps seen. And I'll go to Dr. Bardell, if you don't mind taking us through that and telling us what you've seen.
Thank you very much. What I've seen is how COVID has really amplified the whole inequalities that we live with. I've seen, how not making provision for women workers in your workplace has kind of placed women in a really difficult position now with COVID. The assumption that it's fine to work at home. And yes, I've heard many women talk about how wonderful it's been to work from home, but I've also heard them say, working from home has made childcare very, very challenging because the woman takes care of that part of the business of the domestic environment. And literally not having any free time at all to do their thing. So that whilst in a work environment where you left home to go to work, you were able to have some breathing space from the people that you really love and look forward to going back to them at the end of the day. Right now, you can't. Secondly, you are in a situation where you also have a partner who's also not going to work. And the result of that there has been lots of evidence to show that gender-based violence has increased, not just in South Africa, but all over the world. So for me, what it means for the businesses of the future, if this is the new norm of working from home, how are we going to deal with that reality? And what kind of support do both men and women need who are working from home? And how especially is it affecting their mental health? So rather than a health and safety policy in an organization simply looking at physical health, how do we take mental health more seriously in this COVID period? That's just one example. The other example is that there are lots of other risks as well, and the need to really look at our risk registers and reevaluate the risk registers of all our organizations, because suddenly certain things have come to the fore. Cybersecurity, for example, is a huge issue. And have we moved it from where it perhaps has been to much higher because we're dealing in this virtual environment where we are all affected? And that brings me also to the whole issue of social media. And the fact that social media has become so in our face recently, that it is both a help and a hindrance. It's been a help in that We all saw George Floyd being killed on our phones, and really boost the Black Lives Matter issue dealing with issues of racism. We've seen an example of a CEO in Australia who's had to resign because they did not take enough care of indigenous cultural treasures. We've seen a situation in South Africa with clicks, where an advert has led to many people in positions also having to resign. So that whole thing about individual social responsibility really taking a central role in our lives. So lots of things are being turned over during this time as people become more sensitive to social issues, both in the private and the public sector. And those examples for me again say that the responsibility is not just with the leadership, but with a leadership that also ensures that everybody who works for an organization has to take responsibility to make sure they don't damage the reputation of the institution, but also their own reputation as individual responsible citizens and workers.
Thank you very much. I'm really struck, Dr. Bardell, by the way that you've answered the questions and the true leadership that you're actually demonstrating as the capabilities and skills that actually people should have in this day and age. And it's something that I guess you need to experience and almost adapt and be able to thrive in this very fluid and changing context that we find ourselves in. So, I'm drawn to the empathy that you are showing. I'm drawn to the humility that you show, the sensitive nature in which you've explained some of the conundrums that face organizations and people that work in organizations. So the leadership landscape, the cultural landscape is shifting. It's shifted significantly through the pandemic, but it's a new way of having to cultivate and grow organizational culture, which is actually hugely exciting for the business world and for people at a human level, which is fantastic. So thank you for those comments and thoughts. Roshni, I'm going to hand back to you in the interests of the short amount of time that we have left.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. We've got about 15 minutes left, and absolutely, from what our speakers have said, two things stand out for me. It's the concept of versatile leadership. It's a concept that comes out of the Harvard Business School around a leader that's not only technically competent and smart, but a leader who is well-versed with what's happening in the landscape to be able to make mindful decisions. And that includes looking at leadership self-development, developing the EQ, and adapting to circumstances, because the theory goes that what leaders often do is that they play to their strengths, and that works well up to a point. At some point, like the one we find ourselves in now, the external context and the internal context are both shifting at the same time. And that means that what you thought as a leader was your true strength, at what point in time when the board selected you, the story has changed, right? So how do you evolve and adapt to the story? So before we get into our last question, Pami, from a governance standard, how is that enabled? And then Schnelldorfs, what I'd like to pick up from your side is the difference between human resources and human capital management, and where is the space for that in let's call it the new normal? Pami, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think as you've both said, we can't say the world is changing. The world has changed, and the world, it's just going to be different going forward. And yes, the skills that we had as successful leaders of the past may not be the skills that we need to be successful leaders in the future. And I think for me, the crux of that really is the importance of agility, adaptability, self-awareness, and continuous development and continuous investment in yourself as a being. None of us have made it. And it's talks to Nhlanhla's point about humility. None of us have all the answers, and none of us have nothing more to learn. And for me, that learning is so important, and it's why I believe so strongly in professionalization. And in having people belong to a professional body, keep up with what's going on, attend training, do CPD, and really be future fit, because otherwise you're going to fail if you can't keep future fit for this new world.
Schnelldorfs?
Thanks, Rosh. I suppose the two concepts, the one being human resources and the other human capital. On the human resources side, the emphasis has always been, seeing employees and people as a resource or as a means to get to a particular end. But I think the emphasis has shifted to human capital in the same way that a company would look at, as an example, its financial capital. And I think the emphasis there is that, people are an asset to an organization. And without people and investing in people, you're not going to be able to achieve what you had set out to achieve. Even with technology playing a major role in how work is done, all that it does is that it's not really replacing people, but it's making people to work more efficiently and better. It's making our working lives even much more efficient. So I think for me, it's very important that as we introduce technology and advanced technology in our workplaces, we place a similar kind of effort and emphasis on developing our people with new skills to be able to take advantage of what technology can deliver in an organization.
Thanks, panel. So, from what the third industrial revolution did, it was almost dehumanizing society and creating those inequality gaps that Nozipho spoke about earlier. Perhaps the opportunity in the fourth industrial revolution is to really harness the power of experience, be that physical experience, if that's possible after COVID, or a virtual experience, and trying to narrow these experiential gaps and increase the context so that there can be a fairer spread of information, access to resources, and truly empowering our people to be leaders in their own spheres. So that perhaps takes me to the last question. We have about 10 minutes before we wrap up. If we look ahead to 2044, South Africa will then celebrate its 50-year anniversary as a democracy. And by then, we want to have a nation that we're absolutely proud of, and to have built by that time a compelling South African investment case. From your perspectives, how do you suggest that this be enabled? How do we build this value proposition? And what kind of leadership culture do we need to start building and prioritizing within our organizations, in business, in society, to take us through the next 10 years and beyond? Let's start with you, Nozipho, this time.
Okay, thank you, Roshni. I think the first thing for me is to realize and understand that, we older people, we actually have to make way for young people because it's their future. I think we've had our turn, and we've, I think for me as a South African, I was part of the liberation struggle. I was in exile for many years. I came back home wanting to really contribute to the transformation of our society. I've worked in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors. So I've really had wide experience of work, serving, and so on. I think we need to make way for young people And by doing that, we also need to take responsibility for actually giving them a chance to shape their world for the future. And I think in that regard, both in the public sector, in government spaces, but also in the private sector, where I have seen young people really take a lot more interest in social issues, really understanding the difference between a business that simply looks at the bottom line and a business that takes that has a good understanding of its social context and wants to make a difference. I've watched in the business schools increasingly social entrepreneurship becoming central to the curriculum. And I've seen these young people wanting to do business around making sure that, you know, our natural capital is there. There's they're into water projects, they're into agriculture, they're into making things and creating a whole new industrial consciousness. But we need to give them the opportunity by moving a bit to the side without necessarily not acknowledging that we also have a lot of wisdom to share. So I see sort of that intergenerational conversation going on between ourselves as older people and younger people, where we also listen and are willing to learn from them. I agree with Tantla when he talks about, you know, people as resources. I think women have a lot to give. I think women need to be given a chance to really take more space in the leadership environment, only because they are nurturers of human beings. You know, they may often go on strike, but they're not going to, mainly, they're not going to be violent and destroy life. So I think that an organization, whether it's public or private, that brings more women into the boardroom, that brings more women into management positions, so that their full potential is also reached, but in the process make it better. I always say, if you get it right for Black women, you'll get it right for most of the world, you know. And I feel very strongly about that, because I'm also an advocate of gender equality and women's empowerment. So I'll leave it for there now. I think there's a lot of training and leadership of young people in our organization. At AngloGold, we started a young people's leadership training course for all the youngsters in our company. And it was a project that was led by the chairperson and myself as the chair of the Social Ethics and Sustainability Committee. You know, and it's been so wonderful to see these young people. I brought them into the boardroom so that they could experience what a board meeting is like. So very, very simple, practical things that we can do to encourage young people to take their lives in their hands and shape the future for themselves and their families and communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Nozipho. So we've got a few minutes left. I just want to, take up the note on women in the workplace. And a study that they did in the US in 2019 showed that the number of women in senior roles is increasing. It's at about 29 to 30% last year, and it's the same this year. But the important part is that for every company that was profitable and added a woman to the leadership structure, they increased their profitability by 1%. So it just shows what diversity can do. I'll leave it there. Pami, let's give you an opportunity to wrap up.
Sure, thank you. And I just want to agree with Dr. Bardell on this next generation that are much more socially conscious than our generation was brought up to be. Mervyn King tells a story that he travels all over the world regularly, giving speeches at conferences, etc. And one day his grandson said to him, "But granddad, you travel a lot." And Mervyn thought, this was such a compliment. And his grandson said, "Your carbon footprint must be so high." And these are the things this next generation is talking about. And for me, the students and scholars of today are the leaders of tomorrow. And so I think we need to start at that level, and we need even the education system to start incorporating these aspects of ethical and effective leadership into the curriculums. Make it part of who they are now as young people, so that it's ingrained in them when they are leaders one day. I think that's very important. And I think just from a perspective of boards of 20 years ago didn't look like they look today. They were very pale and male. And now when we look at the diversity we see in boards, yes, we may not be where we'd like to be in terms of gender diversity as well as racial diversity and even age diversity on boards, because actually we need younger people who are going to be future thinking on these boards. But I see in 20 years' time, we're going to have even more diverse boards representative of the real community of the country. And that's going to mean better decision making, to the point you just made around the research, Roshni. Because at the end of the day, the more diverse people we have in challenging each other, the better decisions we're going to make.
Thank you, Pami. Schnelldorfs?
My quick comment and closing comment really is that, going into the future, I think, people that will lead effectively are those that have the ability to unlearn, particularly, outdated models and principles that do no longer fit in the context in which you operate. So the ability to unlearn and learn, new things. The issue of young people and then the younger generation. There's quite a lot of things that we can learn from. I sit in a board or council of one church organization, and we had a session a few weeks ago to look at resetting the organization. And when I observed around, all of us were approaching, either we were over 50 or approaching 50. And I challenged them and said, guys, if we're trying to reset this organization, why don't we have young people in this board or council? So these are some of the things that we need to, as older people sitting in these positions, challenge ourselves. I know it's comfortable to sit in a board, but I think you have to realize that your years and energy are dissipating, and you need to start bringing younger people. So thank you.
A big thank you to our panel today, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface on a really, really important conversation. I'm just taking comfort from the fact that each one of them has a link to the Eastern Cape. So Pami, Schnelldorfs, and Nozipo, we look forward to gleaning your wisdom to help us build better, and perhaps we can carry this on in another time. So I'm sure that all of you remember where you were in '95 when South Africa won the Rugby World Cup. It is one of those moments in South Africa's democratic history that really shines the light inside of each one of us. For me, that's the type of inspirational leadership that is needed in the 21st century in South Africa and in the Eastern Cape. And yes, it is possible. So on winning, Francois Pienaar said, if you lose sight of the way, the burning desire that you do something with, your passion, if you lose the focus, you will stray off course. So you need to keep your eye on the why and not on what if you're trying to achieve your purpose. Thank you so much to our listeners for joining us today and for bearing with us for the technical glitches that we experienced. I hope that you have extracted some value from this discussion today. Remember, of course, October is Mental Health Month in South Africa. Effective leadership is about sound mind and balanced judgment. This can only be done when one is balanced within. So, as we say, in whatever you do, plan or decide, let purpose and sustainability steer your business strategy. Thank you. We'll see you again in November. Until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.